This next poem covers a lot of ground. It has the space station in it. It has the geomorphology of how Florida got turned into land. It has evolution. It has terrorism. It has the Syrian civil war. And it ends with the never seeming to end refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. Day beginning with seeing the International Space Station and a full moon over the Gulf of Mexico and all its invisible fishes. None of this had to happen. Not Florida, not the ibis's beak, not water. Not the horseshoe crab's empty body, and not the living starfish. Evolution might have turned left at the corner and gone down another street entirely. The asteroid might have missed. The seams of limestone need not have been susceptible to sand and mangroves. The radio might have found a different music. The hips of one man and the hips of another might have stood beside each other on a bus in Aleppo and recognized themselves as long-lost brothers. The key could have broken off in the lock, and the nail can refused its lid. I might have been the fish the brown pelican swallowed. You might have been the way the moon kept not setting, long after we thought it would, long after the sun was catching inside the low wave curls coming in at a certain angle. The light might not have been eaten again by its moving. If the unbearable were not weightless, we might yet buckle under the grief of what hasn't changed yet. Across the world, a man pulls a woman from the water from which the leapt from overfilled boat has entirely vanished. From the water pulls one child, another. Both are living, and both will continue to live. This did not have to happen. No part of this had to happen. Practice. I touch my toes. When I was a child, this was difficult. Now I touch my toes daily. In 2012, in Sanford, Florida, someone nearby was touching her toes before bed. 3 weeks ago, in the Philippines or Myanmar, someone was stretching. Tomorrow, someone elsewhere will bend, first to one side, then the other. I also do 10 push-ups, morning and evening. Women's push-ups from the knees. They resemble certain forms of religious bowing. In place of 1, 2, 4, 7, I count the names of incomprehension. Sanford, Ferguson, Charleston, Aleppo, Sarajevo, Nagasaki. I never reach Troy, I have done this for years now. Bystander, listener, one of the lucky. I do not seem to grow stronger. I've been reading you longer poems. I quite like very short poems, and this book has a number of those in it. I'll read you one somewhat short poem and one very short poem. Like others. In the end, I was like others, a person. Sometimes embarrassed, sometimes afraid. When fire was shouted, some ran toward it, some away. I neck deep among them. Obstacle. This body still walking, the wind must go around it. Some of you will know that I've been quite involved for a long time with the dialogue of poetry and science. Many of my best friends are research scientists. And this next poem is called On the Fifth Day. It was written on the fifth day of our current administration, an early warning of what we live in now in terms of the relationship of that administration with science. That was the day they took all of the information about climate change down from the White House website, and the day that every scientist who worked for the federal government was instructed not to speak of their research until prior authorization was given. On the fifth day. On the fifth day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air, and the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. Bound to gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke the fifth day of silence. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jane. So we have, for both Sarah and Jane, we have some questions from the audience that they have sent in via the Q&A. So this first one, it's for both of you. How and where do you find your inspiration, and how do you find the time to relax and decompress during these difficult times?
Let's hear from Sarah first. Who needs to unmute?
Here we go. There we are. For me, it's really, I find myself seeking out the work of artists, new artists, people I've never heard of before, people I have come to rely on, artists like the visual artist Whitfield Lavelle, painter friends like Mary Frank, Joan Snyder. I'm reading a bunch of Jesmyn Ward all over again. I'm reading Gabrielle Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. I think for me, it's to sort of think about beauty, to find beauty in all of its forms, to experience and even practice joy as a form of resistance. That really matters to me.
So I find inspiration wherever I manage to trip over it. So inspiration might be something like that vest with many pockets, which I had been wearing when I travel in lieu of carrying a purse for quite a long time before suddenly one day it turned into the entrance gate to a poem. I certainly, like I think all of us at this festival, find a great deal of inspiration and friendship and company from the work of my fellow poets, fellow artists. I think it is an indispensable support for those of us lucky enough to turn to the arts during difficult times, exactly because art gives you always an alloy, never only grief and a reminder of beauty, a reminder that the world is still worth praising. I have taken up the practice some time ago, before all of this current stage of things began, before the pandemic began. I was in Australia 2 years ago, I guess now, reading at a festival. And one of the Australians told me that there is a generic Australian exclamation of happiness, which is to say, you beauty, you beauty. And somewhere along the line, I decided that this would be the first thing that I would have come to mind every day when I wake up, that I would open my eyes and see whatever was in the room, outside the window, and simply greet it with, you beauty. And that sets the day in a certain direction, and a direction which paradoxically allows it to carry more of the hard things to carry, because it is a kind of antidote to despair. And despair doesn't help anyone. It certainly doesn't help me. I hope that's some kind of answer.
Thank you both for sharing. Another one for both of you. And the question is, I know personally how poems can transform my way of seeing or understanding, but how do you think poets, and we'll expand it to writers as well, just in general, can speak to current events when they're so big and there's so many people speaking about them?
Do you want me to go first, Sarah, or would you like to?
Go first, Jane.
Okay. Well, I think, you just heard from these poems from the book how I try to speak to larger events. And part of it is I'm not trying to speak to larger events, even though some poems end up doing that. I'm just trying to navigate my own way through the fractures of any given day. I never write a poem because I know something. I only write a poem because I am bewildered, baffled, torn, confused, surprised. I write poems to try to bring a larger way of knowing and feeling and understanding into whatever presents itself. And when we're speaking of that in the realms of public events, I can't do it by willpower. I can only do it when that subject matter enters whatever I might be writing that day. And then it will enter it in a peculiar way, which is my life's relationship to it. So I didn't set out to write a Black Lives Matter poem when I wrote the poem Practice. I was doing those push-ups and I realized how close it was to bowing, and the poem entered through that moment, because you write about what matters to you. So I don't think that's much of a prescriptive help, but it's an example of the sort of delicate balance between setting out to say something, which is something many other poets can do, and I commend their work to you. And then poets who work more the way I do, which is simply you try to throw open the windows of your life to what wants to come in and be looked at and be turned into that oddly musical and feeling-filled thought form of engagement, which art brings us.
Thanks, Jane. And so, Sarah, actually, I'm going to have a question that's specifically for you. So we'll go to that one. And it says, my Black neighborhood was taken over by so-called urban renewal, which was seen as Black removal. You have so many talents. This could have been any genre. There could have been any genre to speak of the subject. How did you come to tell it this way?
That's a great question. For me, I think for me, I thought of this particular work in particular as a kind of reckoning with the evidence, the evidence I could find, the evidence I could get my hands on, and the evidence I could not find. And for me to write nonfiction was quite crucial because there was a problem with the issue of mapping and cartography. And in this particular case, we weren't there. There had been no books that had been written about this part of the city. The city, the New Orleans East was missing off of many a map. So I had very specific work, which was to interrogate what it meant, what cartography means, what its power is, what its weakness is, what its blind spots are, what it misses, and what it might mean for someone like me to stand in that role as cartographer and reframe what mattered as I saw it. And so to sort of have this book, which contained the voices of so many people I know and I love, and to have them sort of speak for themselves, and to also be able to interrogate the mythology of a well-known city like New Orleans, which often I think hides behind the stories of itself, and somehow manages to be just the myth often, and to not sort of go beyond. And so I wanted to do what I think really great reporting can do, and also what really great ethnography could do, what really great oral history can do, and really try to make a story about people that allows us to see them up close in all of their banalities, and really try to understand the systems and often the systemic injustices that are baked into the soil of a place. So for me, there was no other way but to write nonfiction in this case. Though I'm excited to not write nonfiction, by the way, after this one.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
And I think one follow-up for that, somebody was asking about, let me see. They said, I'm wondering if you have any insight on what it means to be a regional writer. What advantage do you feel writing in New Orleans gives you?
Well, I think for me that is a question about place, right? And where you come from and what you sort of carry with you of that place. And as I see it, I'm coming from many different places, literally and not so literally. And that's the thing that composes my point of view as a writer. I am really, really proud to claim all my Southern writers and also friends, people like Kiesi Lehman and Jamie Hatlin and Jesmyn Ward and all the people who have gone before me, Maurice Ruffin also. But more importantly than that, I try in my own work to, I think it's important. So for me in particular, that it's a known and given thing that I'm from New Orleans, but I also don't want to be put in a container so that I am only a New Orleans writer, because I want to be able to talk about Cambodia still, and I want to be able to talk about what's happening in Burundi, and I want to be able to talk about, all the places in the global South that matter so much to me, right? So it means a great deal, but I think it also is a kind of liberation for me, that there's something I'm carrying, and the sound of that, maybe the sound of where I'm from, will always show up in the work somehow, right? But that I can be elsewhere, and that freedom is huge for me.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. A good question.
Jane, would you share your thoughts on the relationship between the sentence and the poem? In your writing, does a poem strive to be composed of sentences and so bend to their structural will? Or does the poem bend the form of the sentence? Or is it neither? Or is it just depend? So all options.
So interestingly phrased, bending to its will, as if the sentence could dominate the poem. Not all my poems are in full sentences. There are a fair number of them that are fragmentary, because sometimes all we can do in the face of reality is stutter or offer a list. But I would say that what my poems are perhaps bending to is the musical imperative of how a certain thing you want to say can only come through with certain tones, with certain rhythms, with certain musics. And the music of the sentence is a powerful thing. I quite love the music of the sentence, but I also love the music of the fragment. And when I was very young, a lot of my poems just drifted off with ellipses. And I finally noticed that and went, oh, that's terrible. I must stop doing that. And I stopped. But perhaps the ellipsis reflected who I was when I was very young. I was a person who was timid about making statements. It took a lot of courage for me to have the music of assertion, of statement, come into my poems. And I really had to decide I was worthy of saying something, which as a young woman, I was not at all sure that I was. Because the question was asked, I'm going to make a recommendation of a really great craft book, whether for poets or writers of any kind, or thinkers of any kind, writers of scientific papers. There's this great book that came out this past year called First You Write a Sentence. And I just can't recommend it to you strongly enough. And the premise behind it is, if you can't write a good sentence, in which I would include sentence fragments and all the other possibilities, you can't actually think. That thinking and feeling depend on precise language moving in precise muscular ways, like a well-trained dancer.
Thank you, Jane. Let's see. So this one's for Sarah. And the question and comment reads, Sarah, aching beauty in your reading, beautiful and brief profile of your brother in that passage. How did you approach writing about loved ones? I'm guessing the house as a character helps with your framing of family. Did that help you emotionally too?
Well, I think what was useful for me was so before I started writing, I interviewed all of my siblings quite formally. And I think the distance between my own self and them and the tape recorder between us was actually useful, because it created a kind of structure that, of course, we wouldn't ordinarily have. But it got really weird and really difficult really quickly. And I think that's the point where my training actually in anthropology was useful, because what I realized was that there was no way that I could be objective in any way when it was my family, but I could be a participant observer and be among them, right? And also be talking about them. I think it's very fraught to talk about your family, especially in this very detailed way. But what I tried to do was to put also my own self on the line, and to not skirt when it came to me in relation to them, right? And I also let them, if something felt very difficult to be writing about, I always let them hear about it, you know, so that they have the time to say, no, I don't want to see that in print, or please don't. And they've been written about before. So that really helped me, is that I've been getting them ready in a way for a little bit of time.
So when you talk about, I just have my own personal follow-up. So when you're talking about like formally interviewing them, sitting down with a tape recorder, did you video them?
Yeah, both. I did some video. I did a lot of interviews where I just formally, I have questions, prepared questions for them. And so I have hours and hours and hours, hundreds of hours of audio of them, most of which I transcribed, lots of which I abandoned. And at some point I just had to stop transcribing and start writing, you know. But the interviews allowed me to, what I call, fact check my memory. And I did that a lot. I fact checked memory, not only in the archives, but in the interviews.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
And for both of you, how would you say your writing and work has changed over time?
It's changed so enormously, it's almost hard to give an outsider's account of it. I also try not to have an outsider's relationship with my own poetry, because one of the things which is important for me as a writer is not to either become too self-conscious about what I'm doing, which is odd because when you revise, you have to be fiercely conscious. Editing is you know, without close attention to every, how does a semicolon differ from a dash? If you need a 3/4 pause in the middle of your sentence, you have to be hyper conscious. But there's a certain kind of stepping back and looking at one's own work that I've always tried to avoid, because I've always felt as if, well, if I know what kind of poet I am, maybe I won't allow myself to be the kind of poet that the next poem might ask me to be. I mean, I can say that, you know, over my career as a poet, I was first tagged as an erotic poet. That's eros, not neuros, although I'm sure it was both. So first it was eros, and then I was tagged as a spiritual poet, and then I was tagged as a you know, something else, and now I walk under a banner that nobody ever would have predicted for me 20 years ago, which is suddenly I'm being known as an activist poet and as a spokesperson poet for many beings that don't have their own voice in our language, like rivers and microbes. And, you know, I'm really proud to be a spokesperson for the microbes, but the next poem I write, I want the door wide open to be anything else. That's enough. I mean, I could say more, but that's enough.
Sarah?
I think for me, I don't want to answer that question because I feel like I'm just making my body of work, actually. And even though I've been writing for quite some time, I love what Jane says about not becoming the person who tells myself what kind of writer I am or what the work needs to be. I'm looking for a kind of liberation, you know, of self in terms of the art. So maybe in 5-10 years, I'll have an answer for that.
Okay, I'm going to hold you to that in 10 years. We'll ask the question
Okay.
again. Maybe in person, maybe not over Zoom.
That'll be fun.
So let's see. I think we have one more over here. Maybe, and this is for both of you. maybe you can tell us what you're currently working on.
Well, that's easy for me. One new poem at a time.
And I never never say what I'm working on. It just has to appear. So that's a very easy question for me.
See, that was a quick one. Perfect. I think, let me pull up these questions. One more. For both of you, what was one piece of advice somebody gave you about your work that you kind of go back to when you're struggling?
Sarah, can you take that one?
I think the piece of advice that I love so much that I think about all the time is the advice about, when you're in the process of working, or you're working in the morning, or whenever you work, and you've been working for a while, and the moment that the voices come in and you start to get hypercritical about what it is you're doing, or you're not doing it well enough, or maybe you should look over there and try this, and it's not adequate, then you stop for the day. That's the indication that you're done for the day, and then you start the next day. And even if you've only worked 5 minutes, you work as well as you can in any given time without the feeling that there's a clock or that there's something you must do. But you sort of allow yourself the freedom. And whenever the nagging voices begin, you know that you're done for the day. That's really important for me, to not get bogged down by all the sort of external feelings that come in sometimes. Yeah.
That's wonderful. For some reason, what's coming to mind for me is not advice I was personally given, but a sentence that I have over one of my writing area desk spaces from Goethe, who said, "Never allow what matters least to get in the way of what matters most." And I sometimes feel like, in terms of when people say, what is your writing practice? My writing practice is to attempt to find my way to what that sentence holds.
Thank you both. For both of you, who's been the most influential in your writing life?
Dane, you want to go with that?
I'm really bad at that kind of question. I don't have hierarchical lists. I just don't. I mean, I have been influenced so promiscuously by so many writers, some of whom I've known in person, some of whom I've never known in person, that to say one name is to be rude to the 10,000 others. Forgive me. I'm just some kinds of, when people say, what's your favorite movie? I have no answer. I don't have pinnacles. I only have this moment, who's the last person who saved my life? And, the last person who saved my life most recently would be James Baldwin. That's who I turn to. But a lot of individual poems have also been saving my life. And then I'd just be giving you a list, and lists of names get boring very quickly and tedious. So over to you, Sarah.
Well, I sort of agree with that. I think of writers in particular as accompaniment. And so different writers accompany me depending on what time what I'm moving through. And I would say lately, there are some works that I think of as biblical text, in that they really are a balm for me. And some of them are Sleepless Nights by Elizabeth Hardwick, and Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, and Giovanni's Room by Baldwin, Gail Jones, and also W.G. Zabald, The Immigrants in particular, which has really helped me, especially in these days, understand uh, something about loss and grief. So those are 5 of the ones that have been sort of accompanying me lately.
Well, thank you both. And just to accompany that thought, Jane and Sarah, somebody posted in the Q&A, we've been trained to make choices about our favorite this or that since we were very young children. So it's understandable to, I think as getting older, maybe we're working to break free from that, right? One final question. Is there anything that you're reading right now that you want everyone to know about?
For me, I feel like everyone should be reading this book called The Color of Law, and another book called Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. It is so masterful. It's unbelievable. It's so beautiful too. I've read it like 5 times, and I love the sentences so much. They just contain so much. They're so melodic. So yeah, Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward, and The Color of Law. And I don't remember the guy's name, but that's a great one for now.
And I'll just carry on from what I said before, which is, for me, the book to reread now is The Fire Next Time, because it models absolutely clear seeing and naming and discernment. And the miracle of James Baldwin is that he continues to love, that his generosity of heart and of embrace, no matter what he is looking at, for me is the model of how do we get to a new way of being in this difficult world. That should have been the foundational way of being from the beginning. So The Fire Next Time is the book that I would send everyone to.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank both of you for reading tonight. It was lovely. I just have been taking notes this whole time of things that I need to check out and read following this. And it was just great spending time with both of you.
Well, I love getting to meet Sarah, even just being 2 little boxes next to each other, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and seeing the house that we aren't seeing in person, and seeing all of you who are listening, none of whom we're seeing at all. This is the first teaching by Zoom I've done. This is the first big gathering by Zoom in an ongoing way I've done, and I'm very grateful to be able to be with people, since most of the time, except for going to one march, I've not been being with people. So thank you all very, very much. And thank you for taking such good care of us, Manuel, and Andrea, who nobody can see, but she's here too.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. This was beautiful. Thanks, Jane. I love your work.
Well, thank you so much. And I just dropped a link in the chat. If you have time tonight, we have a faculty reading from Lighthouse faculty. Teachers Nick Arvin, Addie Sai, and Seth Brady Tucker will be reading later tonight at 8 o'clock. Once again, Jane and Sarah, thank you so much. And I hope the 2 of you just have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much. Take care.
We'll see you later. Thanks.